God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we are going to be going over this debate introduction by CJ in his debate with friend of the channel, Idol Killer, on if God decrees everything. And so I thought it might be interesting to look at his opening and then look at maybe some of his rebuttal to see if anything he's saying is making sense, if he's making any good arguments. But spoilers, he does not. He is a train wreck.
All we had to do was follow the train, CJ.
All right, we are going to go ahead and hit play.
We are up to the challenge this evening. The thesis we are here to discuss is the question, does God decree everything that comes to pass? And I, as doubtless you know, will be affirming that God, in fact, does decree, i.e. preordain, determine, whatever you'd like to say, all that is and all that ever will be. As the Westminster Confession puts it, quote, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so as thereby, neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established, end quote.
I do like how he is framing himself and his beliefs so that he's easier to pin down. He has just declared some sort of creed that you can hold him to. And so it might have seemed like a waste of time to some in the comments, but I think it is actually useful for the debate.
One thing which is important to note before we get into my arguments is the following. I and almost every other Calvinist you will meet, I'm not going to speak for all of them, but I think I can confidently speak for most of them, are not denying that mankind has a free will. We see from the confession that I've just quoted that the liberty of secondary causes, that would be us, is not taken away by God's decree according to our belief. We also see that violence, which is a way of saying force or coercion, is rather not offered to the will of the creatures, or in other words, the creature acts on his own accords. He acts from within himself. He does what he most desires to do.
So their definition is a little bit tricky. So they're actually posing a contradiction in terms. They have an idea that God decrees, declares, makes everything come about, even the innermost thoughts. And then he kind of presents it as if free will is originating internally to individuals. No, it's originating from outside of them. And so it's originating from God. And so that is the question of free will. From whence does our decisions, our thoughts, our desires, from whence do they originate? And when I'm talking about originating, I don't mean that like a computer's input-output, you could put a bunch of data into a computer and it's going to do some internal processes and then spit an output. That stuff's not originating from inside a computer. People don't think computers have free will. So if you have any type of system that we are just acting as the middleman processor for data before the output, that's not what normal people think of as free will. Free will actually has to originate somewhere inside ourselves. It can't be just the product of environment. It can't be just the product of genetics or internal makeup or internal metaphysics processing raw data and giving a predefined output. It actually has to be something within ourselves that creates these decisions.
This is important because I suspect at some point an argument will be made either by Mr. McGrew or somebody in the live chat or maybe somebody in the after show. The argument will be made to the following effect, quote, X verse or phenomenon implies or necessitates free will, therefore determinism is false, end quote. But if I, the determinist, and most other Christian determinists like me, are actually agreeing that free will exists and agreeing that determinism and free will are not compatible or not mutually exclusive, if we're affirming these positions, then these kinds of arguments ultimately are fruitless because they don't actually contradict anything that I'm saying. They don't contradict anything in my view, okay?
Right. The only way this works is if Calvinists take concepts that normal people have and redefine them and then claim them. Nobody's talking about what Calvinists think of as free will, where God determines everything, even everything internal to ourselves. They don't think of that as free will. That's like the furthest, that is basically fatalism. Fatalism is not free will. And so you can't just take terms, redefine them, and then claim you believe in them, and then claim that other people are misrepresenting you.
So with that caveat, I want to go ahead and dive right into some of the arguments today. I want to start with some biblical arguments for determinism. While the exact words "God determines every single thing that comes to pass" do not occur anywhere in Scripture, the good book stops mere centimeters short of that exact sentence. Word for inspired, God-breathed, and sacred word.
This is really weird because the Bible is a really big book, and Calvinists really care about this concept. And so if the Bible is that big, why doesn't the Bible unambiguously teach this thing that Calvinists most care about? The truth is, the Bible is not a systematic theology text. It doesn't have these ideas of fatalism and free will and God controlling everything. The Bible is about a relational aspect of God with his creation or his people. It's about interaction. It's about God responding. It's about God being dynamic. His pains, his sufferings, how he interacts with people, and how we can interact with God. This is antithetical to Calvinism, the story of the Bible. But the Bible is a big book, and it does not have Calvinism. And here's almost what looks like a blatant admittance of it. And so as pointed out in the book, The Body of Gods by Benjamin Summers, argument from silence is actually legitimate when you have such a big body of work, a textual reference to pull from.
For example, Proverbs 16, verse 4, the good King Solomon tells us that the Lord hath made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. End quote.
So Matt Slick tried to use this verse on Will Duffy, and I got up in the questions and answers portion, and I asked Matt Slick, why a different translation. There's other people who translate that verse differently, and some not in a Calvinistic sense. And I'm going to cut to that clip real shortly, but I asked him what in the text recommends his translation over those other translations, and he didn't have an answer. This is not really a proof text. They have to rely on a very specific translation, and they just have to hand wave other translations.
All right, thank you. We all know that translation is a difficult process. Words have multiple meanings and multiple ways to be taken. I'm talking right now about Proverbs 16:4. Can you defend the translation you use over these two alternative translations? The NIV, the Lord works out everything for his own ends, even the wicked for the day of disaster. Or the ICB, the Lord makes everything work the way he wants it, even has a day of disaster for evil people. So what makes the translations that you use superior to these translations?
There are different kinds of translations. Some are dynamic and some are literal. And so the NASB, for example, tries to get the actual literal meaning. Then you can have a paraphrase. So you have a wide variety of translations. The NASB is what I use because that's what Paul the Apostle used. I don't know that, but because it's more literal to the original languages. And so since I'm not a Hebrew scholar, that's why I use the NASB and hold it what it says.
So would these alternative translations also be valid?
Well, it depends. You want me to really answer this? Okay, yo tengo hambre. That's Spanish, I have hunger. Literally it's I have hunger. But we don't say it like that. We say I'm hungry. Mm-hmm. And so if we're to do a literal translation, if I were to literally translate that, I have hunger. Now that's a dynamic, or that's a very literal. Now what if I were to just say, hey dude, I'm craving grinds? That's another translation of that, which is a surf talk. Mm-hmm. So along the issue and the scope of translation styles, then you say, what is the intent when they're trying to do that? So you can have literalness, which is accurate, non-literalness, which is accurate. So it's not that they contradict. The real thing that needs to be done is to go into the Hebrew, get an interlinear, and look and see what the words say, and then just do the best you can for literalness, because this is what we need at this point. So it's not an easy question to answer. I'm not trying to muddy the waters. That's just the nature of what it means. You know?
Duffy, any comment?
No, appreciate that. Thank you.
Herein we see that God has made everything for himself, for his own glory, including the wicked, whom God has made specifically for the day of destruction, wherein he will demonstrate to all people his righteousness. Nothing happens, not even evil things, not even wicked people, which does not happen specifically for God. He says he makes all things for himself. And it is said again in Ephesians 1:11, quote,
So what you see here is proof texting. He has a proof text, and he explains what he thinks it means, and there's no contextual analysis. He's just kind of restating the things in his verse. He doesn't look before that verse and after that verse to try to figure out the semantic range, what kind of concepts are being communicated, whether his interpretation is actually enforced by the context. He's just reading a verse and restating some of the words in the verse and just asserting it means his theology. This is bad proof texting.
In whom we have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will, end quote. According to this verse, God works.
All right, so if I eat all things according to my diet, does that mean I eat all things? No, he's taking a verse which is talking about God's thought process. God doesn't do things haphazardly. God doesn't do things in a rushed manner. Everything God does, he does after thinking about it, which thinking is disallowed in Calvinism. God can't contemplate. But yeah, God has a counsel of his own will. The verse disproves Calvinism. God has internal deliberations and thought processes, and that helps God decide what to do. All things God does, he does after internal deliberation. It's not Calvinism.
All things without any exception after the counsel of his own will, which is otherwise stated, everything does exactly as God has decreed it. And if you think that's a stretch on my part, here's a fun fact for you. The Greek word boule, which is translated here as counsel, literally translates, according to Help's word study on Bible Hub, as well as numerous other resources you can find both there and elsewhere, as decree or otherwise as a resolved plan used particularly of the immutable aspect of God's plan, which is a direct quote from that Help's word studies.
So here he's lying. CJ is lying. He's taking a radical, nonsensical definition, and then he's just applying it, and he's trying to rope in other dictionaries. No, he's a liar. This Help's word study is absolutely ridiculous. It's associated with Calvinistic colleges, Moody Bible Institute, things like that, and it's just off its rocker. And what he fails to tell you is how Thayer's actually translates this in various contexts. There's a wide range of meanings and a wide range of usages. And yes, within the Bible, people resist God's boulamai, his strong will. CJ's just lying. Is it intentional, or is it because he's incompetent? That's what we got to ask. Is this guy just a fraud, or is he just not intelligent enough to understand what's going on here with this word? Here is the word, and we're looking at Strong's Concordance, and it just means counsel, deliberation, wisdom, or decree, which, yeah, that's just normal stuff. It doesn't necessitate any Calvinist concept. Then underneath that, we have the Help's word study, which you could hardly find any information on who built this and how they came to their conclusions. But look at this. Properly a resolved plan, used particularly of the immutable aspect of God's plan. What are you talking about? Where are you getting this? How are dictionaries written? Dictionaries are written by taking the word, looking at its use in context. Where are they coming to these conclusions? It's absolutely ridiculous. And so him quoting this as some sort of authoritative source, number one, that's not how dictionaries work. And number two, this is ideologically radical and absurd. They're just making this up. They're just pulling it out of their butt. This level of God's plan, boule, demonstrates he is the Lord of history, always in charge, with an exclamation point. These people are hacks. And how do we know that? Well, let's go look at Thayer's right below. Thayer's actually lists where this word is used. And very interesting, yeah, it's used in Homer for counsel or purpose. And no, Homer's not using it about some immutable aspect of God. No, that's not how the word's used. That's stupid. Helps is stupid. CJ, you're stupid. Luke 23:51. What happens in Luke 23:51? Oh, let's go hover over that. Now, there's a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their boulamai in action, and he was looking for the kingdom of God. Oh, wow, we see a boulamai being resisted, a boulamai attributed to people. Where else is this word used? Here's Luke 7:30. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the boulomai of God for themselves, not having been baptized of him. So here we have a clear refutation of the Helps quote-unquote dictionary, that hack piece of garbage work, where people are just rejecting and not following God's boulomai. Warren McGrew doesn't seem to be aware of this verse in the conversation and doesn't hold CJ to account of CJ's absolute ridiculous takes about this word and how this word is used and how this word is defined. The Pharisees resist God's will. Calvinism is false. Remember, he's trying to define it as, let's turn back to Helps. Properly, a resolved plan, used particularly of the immutable aspect of God's plan, purposefully arranging all physical circumstances, which guarantees every scene of life works to his eternal purpose. Oh, the Pharisees reject God's will. You're stupid. CJ, you're stupid. Helps word studies, you're garbage. So notice in Thayer's all the different usages of the word and all the different contexts and all the different meanings. So we see that this word is regularly used for other things in other contexts with other meanings and not about God's immutable plan. And especially, even when it's used about God, this is not a plan that can't be rejected or can't be thwarted. The Calvinists are grasping at straws. And so my biggest disappointment with this debate was that CJ wasn't instantly put down and humiliated on this point. Warren McGrew just didn't have the resources available to him to do that. But it's a very shameful action by CJ. This is a very shameful part of the debate. But he's got 6.5 minutes left. Let's see what he does with it.
So this verse can reasonably be understood as God saying that he works every single thing out according to his immutable decree. In fact, it's not that it could be reasonably understood that way. It's just what the verse means. This is nearly repeated in Romans 8:20.
So these are these weird assertions that he makes that, it's just, my view is just absolutely. Warren actually calls him out on this. Warren says, you can't just assert that your position's true. That's what we're contending here.
Wherein Paul says to his readers that God is working all things together toward a certain righteous goal. Here's the quote. And we know that all things work together for good, to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose, end quote. This also seems like a good time for me to point out that the phrase according to found in both Ephesians 1:11 and Romans 8:21.
So let's talk about this verse as well. We already see that he quotes proof texts in which God has internal deliberations, necessitating that Calvinism is false, that God thinks about things. Now he's quoting a verse in which the word synergy is used. Now Calvinists love the word monergism. They have a whole website called Monergism in which they post all their Calvinist writings. They hate synergy and synergism. And so synergy, working together, God working with things, that's the word being used in this context. And now Kim Godart, he was so kind as to send me his book when I contacted him, but he has a whole chapter on this and the usage of this word here. He says, now to the second time I changed my understanding of this verse, even the translation that is given in the NIV needs to be reconsidered. The biggest problem with the NIV version is it still misunderstands what the verb synergy, work together, really means. Even if God is the subject, and the NIV treats synergy as though it means working things together, i.e. forming a pattern or mixing ingredients together so that something new emerges. Synergy in Greek is not about one party working various ingredients together. It is more than one party working a common project. It means quite literally work together. If Romans 8:28 says that God works together, then the obvious question to be asked is, with whom? If we read the text differently, the answer is clearly supplied in Romans 8:28. Unless synergy is being used here in a way completely unprecedented in the New Testament, Romans 8:28 is not about God fitting all things together in a pattern for our benefit. It is rather about God and those who love God working as partners, working together to bring about good in all situations. So this is absolutely a valid reading, and it's a reading which would mean Calvinism is false. God is working with people. People are helping work all things together for the glory of God, to put things together in the right place, to create the ideal universe. And that's probably what Paul is talking about in context. So again, CJ's just assuming his reading of verses are true. He doesn't seem to be aware of the alternatives.
And its Greek equivalent, kata, are variant ways of saying as stated in or by way of. So God works all things as stated in his immutable plan is quite literally what these verses are meaning to communicate to us. All things work for good.
As Michael Heiser states, don't make dogmatic arguments based on particular readings of prepositional phrases. Prepositions are flexible. That you're misrepresenting how language works, CJ, when you're claiming, oh, it can be read this way, therefore it means my interpretation. CJ is just a mess and a fraud. He's not scholarly or intellectual. We're watching a dumpster fire. It's real bad.
For those who are called by way of his purpose. The scripture also speaks elsewhere of God's exhaustive sovereignty. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, the prophet Isaiah, inspired of God like the rest of them, tells us this, quote, I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God besides me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know, from the rising of the sun and from the west, that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things, end quote.
All right, let's talk about this verse as well. Let's go turn to the book Act and Being Towards a Theology of Divine Attributes, in which he talks about how Greek attributes of incomparability, these ineffability, immutability, these types of things are just not part of the biblical witness. And let's see what he says about this verse. The question is repeated, to whom will you compare God? What image will you compare him with? Isaiah 40:18. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One, verse 25. The form of the question might clearly expect the answer, nothing. And yet the whole passage is set in a context of revealed theology of creation in which affirmations of a wholly positive kind are made about God's power, as is manifest in creative action. The God of this writer is known through his redemptive historical action. And it is this which is found in Isaiah's confidence that God is Israel's goal, or next of kin, the word that has come to be translated as Redeemer, and so to form the basis for a whole theology of God's holy love. This is an image, concrete and personal, with which God can indeed be compared. Drawing on the tradition of God's redemption of Israel from Egypt, the prophet compares God to one whose responsibility it was to redeem a family member from slavery, so that his critical theology is only directed against idols and does not provide the basis of the kind of independent, negative theology which we meet in the tradition. So what's this saying? What it's saying is that when God talks about who is my equal, who can compare to me, he's on another level. People can compare, but they're so far below him, that's the point. God is within the passage, within the structure of what's happening. God is personal and relational. He's not the God of the omnis and ims, immutable, decreeing all things. That's not what this is about. This is about God's comparative power, especially in the context of being Israel's God, a relationship. And so the context just doesn't support this verse being read for concepts of negative theology. But CJ is going to read it in that light because he really needs a proof text. And here's a proof text that kind of reads something, kind of close to what he wants to make a point about. So he's going to read this verse, and then he's going to make a bunch of claims without any contextual analysis.
Again, that's Isaiah 45, verses 5 through 7. Here God tells us that he is the one who both forms the light and creates the darkness. It is he who makes both peace and creates evil, or calamity if you prefer. There is none like or besides him who does any of these things. In other words, God is telling us that he, through his servant Isaiah, that he is sovereign over both sides of the entire coin.
So let's watch what CJ does. It's kind of slimy. He has verse 45, and it says, I am the Lord, there is no other. Yeah, he's God. There's no one else is God. I form lightness and create darkness. And now CJ is going to take the there is no other, and then he's going to transfer it down to this sentence. And so CJ is reading this as, I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness, there is no other. I make well-being and create calamity, there is no other. I am the Lord who does all these things. No, God's just talking about normal things that he does. These are power acts. This is about him saying, I can do all these things. I'm the one who's in control. I'm powerful. And so he's not saying that nobody in no capacity in any form whatsoever can create light and create darkness, meaning good things and bad things, well-being, prosperity, calamity, evil. In fact, throughout the Bible, people create evil themselves, as the Bible reads that in James 1:13, let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So here's a verse distancing God and saying each person is responsible, each person is creating that evil within themselves. CJ is taking a powerful statement about God being the deciding sovereign king over history and making the Assyrians attack Israel, moving Cyrus to become king and take over his empire and liberate Israel. These macro events, this control of history, and CJ is saying, okay, now God controls cat farts. Thanks, CJ. Very, very brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for that.
There is no lesser dualistic deity working against his will. The light is him. The darkness is also him. He retains supremacy over every single thing. All happens by him and for him with no exceptions. And we see this repeated again in 1 Corinthians, where we read, quote, but to us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. And that's 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6.
Yep, and I didn't see anything in there that says God determines every single cat fart. That's not what it's talking about. God created everything and he sustains everything. This is just normal biblical theology. And CJ will have God controls everything, micromanaged in a micromanaged fashion in which nothing happens apart from God's meticulous control and determination. I just don't see that in the context. And he has to make a contextual argument. Instead, he's reading short phrases, which could have various meanings, and just asserting that his reading is the true meaning of that small phrase.
Everything is by him. Everything is for him. Everything is through him. Every single solitary thing, there is no exceptions.
Notice that none of that is in this verse. He's just making assertions, adding text to the verse because the text itself doesn't speak for itself. He has to add more stuff to it.
The text leaves absolutely no room for any ambiguity.
If the text left no room for ambiguity, he wouldn't have had to add a whole bunch of stuff to it. This is just being dishonest.
In my humble opinion. We could exhaust the text by looking at all the different ways in which God shows us his decree, but I also want to present a little bit of a logical argument for determinism, and I am short on time. It is rather simple, and yet I believe completely impossible for a non-determinist to rebut. The question I have, which makes the argument, is this. If God creates all things, and is sovereign over all things, and is at all places and in all times, in other words, omnipresent and eternal, knows all, past and future, can do anything to intervene at any point, and can create anything in any way such that what he knows will happen on path A does in fact not happen, then what does it even mean for God to allow something over and against his determining it? Picture a scenario. Suppose I had a perfect understanding of lions and decided to put a lion in a 4x4 room. I ensured that the lion...
Yeah, so he needs to be spun up on his Calvinism. He needs to go read Calvin's entire section on no mere permission, and which Calvin basically calls this type of argument stupid or imbecilic. And he basically criticizes the people who say, oh, God just lets things happen, or God's passive in it, rather than a meticulous, detailed control. And so we do have a podcast on no mere permission in which we do go over Calvin's pretty lengthy writing on the subject. And so that's the difference it'll make. Maybe CJ's unaware of what Calvinism actually believes. Maybe he's playing naive, or maybe he is naive. Maybe he's not the smartest guy.
He was hungry, not hungry enough to lose his strength, but hungry enough that he's going to eat the next food that is in front of him, and that he couldn't escape the room, so he's not going to go find food somewhere else, okay? Even though I have full power to let him loose or feed him and so forth, this is the path I have decided to take. I next put a nice, meaty zebra in the same room, ensured that he had no means of escape, and just decided to see what happens. Now, of course, we all know full well exactly what happens. The lion has lunch is exactly what happens. Now, I didn't force the lion to eat the zebra. I didn't puppeteer him or possess him or anything of that sort. So, in a manner of speaking, you could say I merely allowed the lion to eat the zebra, right?
There was a talk on the God is Open page about this hypothetical. Maybe it was one of his friends or something who posed it and saying, oh, if you put food and there's someone starving, they have no choice but to eat it. And I pointed out that throughout history, there's been plenty of people who have died due to starvation, due to hunger strikes in prison. I was just reading about a guy from India, some communist, who died during a hunger strike in prison. And yeah, so giving people food, people still have volition, even though you might claim here, you might say, oh, you are determining that this person eats the food because the food is there. He has to use the example of a tiger or some sort of dumb brute or dumb beast, because his example, if using a human, doesn't quite follow. It falls apart. So we have to use some sort of less than rational species in order to claim that this determinism is true. Notice that he's implicitly equating us to dumb animals in the same way. I reject this. I reject CJ's anthropology.
And of course, the answer is obviously not. That doesn't make any sense. Any functional definition of the word would tell us that I absolutely determined the zebra would be eaten by that lion at that time and in that little room.
Yeah, but the word determine doesn't mean Calvinist determination. So if you just go look up what the word is, we talked about this just on our last podcast, talking about Marlon Wilson and his use of the word determine, in which he conflates intellectually coming to some sort of conclusion with a determination. And so it's another of these bait and switches. Calvinists are hijacking language, hijacking words, making words mean what they obviously don't mean. And no, this type of putting a tiger in a cage with a zebra is not the type of determinism that he's arguing in this debate. He's talking about meticulous control of all things, not just arranging some circumstances and so to make an outcome highly probabilistic. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about fatalism, and he's equating the two. It's a bait and switch.
But my friends, at best for the non-determinist, this is the position God is in every single time anything ever has ever occurred, without exception. Let me give you an example.
Except for the fact that in the Bible, God regrets his own decisions because things do not turn out how God expects them to turn out. We have Genesis 6, and of course the instance of Saul, in which God regrets making Saul king. We have God doing things in vain. He struck the children in vain. They didn't take his punishment. God has regrets about people and failed expectations. So the biblical God does not use the type of determinism that CJ would have us believe. This is an extra biblical argument based on his own fallacious reasoning. He's trying to smuggle words into the debate with his smuggled definitions, and it's all outside the biblical text, this hypothetical. He doesn't want us thinking about the biblical text, and especially the examples in the Bible in which the contrary to this actually happens. We have a data set of the Bible, and his type of determinism does not exist in that data set.
Example. God created the Garden of Eden. He created Adam and Eve. God created Adam and Eve in the way in which he created Adam and Eve, meaning, in other words, if one wants to say something to the effect of, well, Eve never saw God create and therefore was more easily deceived, that could be true. And that was also God's choice, which he was wise enough to know what he was doing. God created the serpent, and he created the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He created, he placed the tree and Adam and Eve and the serpent together with each other in the Garden of Eden at the same time as each other. He knew exactly what would happen if he did so. He couldn't have happened unless he allowed it. He was also there in both place and time when Eve talked to the serpent, and he could have intervened at any point in which he desired to do so. In what way, then, using any functional definition of the word, can we say God did not determine the events that then followed suit?
Well, glad you asked. Okay, so there's a bunch of definitions to the word. Number one, to cause something to occur in a particular way, to be the decisive factor. Okay, so that's not Calvinist determination. That's just, here's the example. It will be her mental attitude that determines her future. Yeah, that's not fatalism. Okay, so definition one is off the table. Okay, so number two, ascertain or establish exactly, typically as a result of research or calculation. Oh yeah, so God thinking through things. Yeah, so that might not be the answer you're looking for, because that undermines and means Calvinism is false. So maybe definition 2 is out. 3 is to firmly decide. He determined on a withdrawal of his forces. Again, that's not Calvinist determination. That's making an internal decision, and whether or not it actually happens is something else. And 4 is an archaic definition, to bring or come to an end. Maybe one of the 4 might fit what you're going for here, CJ, but your question of what definition this doesn't work for, like all of them, all the definitions, CJ. You're off on all the definitions of determine.
I would posit to you that it's ridiculous to even suggest that he did not determine the events that ended up happening in Genesis chapter 3, or any other events that have taken place in human history for that matter. Why any other events? Because we can do this thought experiment for every single event that has ever happened. They all end in the exact same place. And this doesn't even address the accumulative argument that we could make from various scenes in the scripture in which God tells us that he determined X, Y, or Z. For example, in Acts chapter 4, he says, quote, "The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ, and of a truth against the holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed. Both Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined beforehand to be done." And
yes, and sometimes within the Bible, people determine things as well. It's just a normal word used in a normal way. And so there's nothing about that context to recommend Calvinistic determination. This is one of those arguments in which he doesn't do any contextual analysis. He assumes his position is true when there's more sensible, reasonable, and rational alternative readings of his own proof text. And remember, they keep quoting proof texts that mean Calvinism is false.
quotes, Acts chapter 4, verses 26 through 28. There's that word boule again, by the way. Here it's translated as counsel, and just as before. And God's boule apparently determined that the crucifixion would happen. And as it turns out, so did his labor or power or strength, however you'd like to phrase it, i.e. his hand, right? The kings gathered together to do only what God's power and decree had already determined beforehand would be done.
Right. And in the passage in which the lawyers resist the boule, the will of God, God's will doesn't always happen. And Jesus didn't think that just because God had a determined plan for the crucifixion, that the crucifixion was a set fatalistic event. Remember, Jesus said a legion of angels could come save me. In the garden, he's praying that he forgoes the crucifixion, but he understands that the crucifixion might be important. And so he hedges his prayer and says basically that if you really needed this to happen, God, just kind of ignore my prayer and your will, not mine. But he understood that this was not a fated event. God's boule could be resisted as it is within the scriptures. This is a mess. 18 seconds left.
We can see this again in Genesis 50, which is repeated in Genesis 45. We could, in fact, go to Isaiah chapter 10, or we could go to Genesis 49, or we could go to Romans 9, but we're short on time, so I'll just give you the conclusion, which is this. Scripture tells us God does all for his glory by way of an immutable decree. Logic tells us a being in God's position could not allow something over and against his determining it, and history through Scripture shows us God determines things all the time. The only question I have for the audience is thus: will you accept the plain revelation of God and his scriptures? And with that, I will yield my time if I have.
Anyways, CJ seems like a mess. He doesn't seem like an intellectual or a scholarly type of individual. His arguments are fallacious. He doesn't understand how language works. He hijacks language. He assumes things that aren't obvious, and he does the normal Calvinist proof text thing. So he's indicative of the Calvinist mindset, who these Calvinists are, the type of personalities that are attracted to Calvinism. It's not a pretty picture. The comments, for the most part, have CJ as a loss in this debate. I think Warren did very good in his opening and rebuttal. I think he touched every single one of CJ's points. Maybe not in the way that I would have, but at least he makes an effort. So Warren, public perception is that Warren, idol killer, won this debate, and I think that's due dessert. Anyways, we're going to cut there for today. Maybe we'll do the rebuttal maybe at another time, but if you have any comments or questions, put that down below. Start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.